Hello, the title of this lecture is Economics, History, and Theory. I use this as an introductory lecture to one of my economic histories. Economics is the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternate uses. Another definition of economics is that it is a study of how people satisfy their wants by means of the production and distribution of goods and services through the process of exchange. The study of these activities over time is economic history. The study of economic history has a practical and utilitarian value. It reveals clues on the causes of economic growth or decay. Economic historians are interested in measuring economic change and explanations for change. The focus can be on microeconomics that deals with the interactions among individual decision-making units within an economy, such as a household, business, or government. Also, the focus can be on macroeconomics that centers on the economic performance of the entire economy. Historians investigate growth and stability of a nation. To better understand the economic strength of nations in an earlier period, economic historians look at national output, national income, national savings rates, and the national unemployment rate. The economic health of a country says much about the standard of living of citizens. The history of economics stretches back thousands of years, from Old Testament times and the earliest civilization. Commentators wrote about economic matters. Modern economics began in 1776 with Adam Smith, the Scottish professor and author of the influential Wealth of Nations. One of Smith's major insights is that exchange between two parties where there is no coercion or violation of freedom will only occur if each side benefits, and that people who pursue their own interests will provide benefits to society in general, even if it was not their intention to do so, as it is often the case. So these were two important insights. The genius of Smith included how he defined the notion of a zero-sum model that said one party's gain was another party's loss. Zero-sum was the flawed understanding of mercantilism that had dominated in the previous 2 centuries. Smith also rejected government intervention or any other obstacles that hindered a free market. Smith represents the beginning of the classical school of economics. And here's one quote from Smith. "It is the highest impertinence and presumption in kings and ministers to pretend to watch over the economy of private people and to restrain their expense. They are themselves always and without any exception the greatest spendthrifts in the society. Let them look well after their own expense, and they may safely trust private people with theirs. If their own extravagance does not ruin the state, that of their subjects never will." So there you have Adam Smith. So he was in essence, he's the beginning of the classical school of economics. The classical school holds that, quote, free markets allocate resources in the fairest and most efficient manner, that government intervention in the economy obstructs prosperity, and that competition creates opportunities for enterprising businesses and individuals, end of quote. Another important classical thinker was French economist JeanBaptiste Sartre, who wrote the Treatise of Political Economy. This was written in 1803. Say's law states that supply creates its own demand. Supply creates its own demand. This understanding challenged the fear that the growing output of an economy could reach the point where it would exceed the ability of the people to buy it, leading to unsold goods and unemployed workers. Say explained that a society or nation could never produce too much. He wrote, quote, otherwise, how could it be possible that there should not be bought and sold in France 5 or 6 times as many commodities as in the miserable reign of Charles VI? Say reasoned that the process of production created income for people in the form of wages, rents, interest, and profits. As impressive as JeanBaptiste Sartre was, the leading economist of the early 19th century was British David Ricardo, who wrote the Principles of Political Economy, and that was published in 1817. Ricardo was a staunch free trader who introduced the theory of comparative advantage. He argued that 2 nations should specialize in the production of goods that they can produce more efficiently than any other nation, and then exchange their surpluses. Specialization would increase efficiency in both countries, expand total output, and improve prospects for prosperity. Other notable 19th century thinkers who wrote on economics included Thomas Malthus, Karl Marx, Karl Menger, and Alfred Marshall. The socialist economics of Marx found little attraction in America beyond small groups of progressives at several stages of American history. And if we look at the 20th century, we see that there was a socialist party, actually a candidate for the president in the early 1900s. And there was a surge of socialism during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And then in more recent years, we've seen increasing number of young people looking at socialism as perhaps a better approach to the economy. So what we find is that this is kind of hit and miss, and it's just sort of different times in American history where we have sort of a surge of socialist thinking. Now, by the end of the 19th century, the field of economics received greater attention in universities. In 1886, the discipline gained its first scholarly journal. the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And that was published at Harvard University. In the 20th century, there was increased interaction of economic theory and political action. British economist John Maynard Keynes is probably the most influential economist of the modern era. His greatest book was The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And this was published in 1936. Well, what's remarkable about Keynes, one of many things that is that actually his training was in mathematics, but he did write some very important books. Well, those who followed his lead centered their policies on the spending habits of consumers, viewing government involvement as wise and essential. Keynesians support higher government spending to increase people's incomes and consequently their confidence to spend money. There is the belief that higher incomes and stronger consumer confidence caused a rise in aggregate demand. This is defined as the total amount of a good, service, or resource that people are willing and able to buy. The rise of aggregate demand stimulated business investment, employment, and economic growth. Seeing this model as primarily a redistribution model, critics noted that the problem of Keynesians using it as a method of actually spurring income growth through income redistribution. They saw this as problematic. An opponent of Keynesian thinking is the Austrian School of Economics, led by Austrian economists Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. As a result of their libertarianism, the Austrian economists are especially anti-government. Mises' uncompromising rejection of government intervention resulted in him being ignored by most academic historians. Although on the periphery in academia, Austrian scholarship such as Hayek's The Road to Serfdom and Mises' Human Action opened the eyes of many to the problems of a planned economy. Extolling the virtues of capitalism, the Austrians trust this free market system to be far superior to a planned economy, notably how the market allocates society's limited resources in an efficient manner. In Austrian economics, entrepreneurship is central. Business people are to be alert to new opportunities for innovative goods and production that may or may not be successful. When people exercise poor judgment in the market, they were to take responsibility. The Austrians believed that this emphasis on accountability encouraged people to conduct business as intelligently as possible. There was a common sense attractiveness to Austrian ideas for those distrustful of economic and government experts. Contrast to mainstream economic thinking, the Austrians argue that goods did not have any inherent value in themselves. They are valued because they help to satisfy some human want or need. Individuals bought and sold from each other because each person sought to maximize their satisfaction by exchanging what they value less for what they value more. In this way, the satisfaction of all is increased. The Austrians embraced methodological individualism. That is, they focus on individual actions, preferences, and initiatives. It makes little sense to Austrian economists to adopt complicated algebraic equations or formulas to stipulate the conditions needed to realize market equilibrium. Their focus is on the market process because consumers, quote, are constantly learning, changing tastes, and demanding new products to meet new wants. The Austrian suspicion of quantitative economics was a barrier for greater academic status, but this could be advantageous in gaining recruits put off by mathematical jargon. The Chicago School of Economics also was suspicious of government planning, but it favored monetarism. Monetary theory focuses on the role of money in causing both inflation and cyclical disturbances. For monetarists, the ideal system is when the money supply increases at a steady or neutral rate. You could say this is the monetarist rule. A recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, Professor Milton Friedman, made his mark while teaching economics at the University of Chicago. As an integral member of the Chicago School of Economics, he presented specific data and arguments against government intervention. The much greater rise in the quantity of money compared to the quantity of goods and services available for purchase was a serious problem in the 1970s. And the monetarist Friedman offered his understanding that inflation in the United States was a monetary phenomenon linked to the rapid increase in government spending, government's full employment plan, and a flawed policy adopted by the Federal Reserve System. The government's push to increase the quantity of money to finance bigger government and the Federal Reserve with its obsession with interest rates guaranteed inflation. According to Friedman, the cure for inflation was to simply reduce the rate of monetary growth, easily said, but politically difficult to do since such action brought painful side effects, including approximately 2 years of lower economic growth and higher unemployment before improvements showed. Socialists saw Friedman as a, quote, hyperactive extremist of the right, end of quote. But the prize-winning economist made his mark both in academic circles and with mainstream America, that is, with ordinary Americans. There were his numerous writings published in Newsweek and his influential public broadcasting service, Free to Choose television series that aired in the year 1980. Complementing the series was the very popular book, Free to Choose, a personal statement written by Friedman and his wife, Rose. Rose was also an economist. The impact of the television series and the book was far-ranging, capping off almost 2 decades of growing influence on economic discussion. In Free to Choose, the Friedmans covered much ground beyond monetarism. They gave engaging accounts of the power of the market, the downside of regulations, the shortcomings of the cradle to grave model, and the pressing issue of, issues of inflation, race, education, and consumer and worker protection. For the Friedmans, regulations and controls represented tyranny since they restricted economic freedom and freedom of speech, press, and religion. And he gave examples of this. Governments and unions exerted power in the academic community, in media circles, and in religious schools. So the government had control or exerted power with academics by way of government grants to professors. And also they exerted power in media circles, particularly when you have union politics going on, where journalists are favoring certain political groups. And also in religious schools where there would be various controls by government. Vital for the Friedmans was the promotion of material prosperity and human freedom, both of which rely on the other. Simply put, competitive capitalism and political freedom went hand in hand. They embrace Adam Smith's insights, that is, exchange between two parties where there is no coercion or violation of freedom will only occur if each side benefits. The beneficial results of a free market price system, working best with voluntary transactions rather than central control, offered a stark contrast to a command system expected to successfully coordinate the activity of millions of transitions in an economy in the hope of making everyone better off. Free to Choose argued that only the price system provided essential transmission of information for an economy to be healthy. Government interference often led to disappointing results nationally and internationally. The Friedmans stated that the well-intentioned programs of the welfare state were a flop. And rather than mistakes of execution, the root problem was the use of bad means to achieve good objectives. They rejected liberal arguments that stated government programs failed because they were not large enough, and more money from Congress was the solution. The Friedmans pointed out that the public housing was an obvious failure, citing examples of housing deterioration due to less incentive to maintain and improve such buildings. Evidence showed relief roles continuing to grow even as prosperity grew, and that once on relief, people had less reason to earn an income. And there was the general inefficiency and lack of accountability in the burgeoning bureaucracy pertaining to other components of the welfare state, such as Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. When government bureaucrats spent someone else's money on someone else, there was no self-interest motivation to ensure the effective use of money in a way beneficial to recipients. The Friedmans also had little trust in labor unions protecting workers. They argued that the interests of a labor union often are not the interests of its members, that any gains made for union members came primarily at the cost of other workers, and that all workers, union and non-union, paid more for consumer goods when high union wages drove up prices. Even minimum wage laws demanded by labor unions hurt low-income people because they decreased the number of jobs. Young people, for example, lost the opportunity to have lower wage jobs where they could gain valuable on-the-job training. All in all, the best protection for most workers was a growing free market economy and the existence of many employers who competed for the services of workers. Competitive capitalism meant higher productivity and good paying employment, all accomplished at nobody's expense, as this was argued by the Friedmans. The Friedmans' strong criticism of Keynesian government intervention and their championing of freedom attracted much support, but it was not enough for supply side proponents who had no faith in the philosophy of monetarist solutions. So these supply siders were supportive of a fair bit of what the Friedmans had to say, but they themselves did not support monetarism. Now, supply side doctrine differed from the so-called trickle-down economics that some link to William Jennings Bryan's famous Cross of Gold speech delivered in 1896. Bryant said, quote, "There are those who believe that if you will only legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, their prosperity will leak on through to those below," end quote. Sullying trickle-down economics was the notion that it defended wealth and privilege, but critics were mistaken to confuse supply side and trickle-down as one and the same. Fundamental to supply side doctrine was increasing the size of the economic pie, not simply slicing it differently. In other words, with supply side economics, there was the creation of additional wealth rather than the transfer of existing wealth to business owners. And the chart shows the difference between demand and supply side theories. So demand would be something that Keynesians would adopt, and supply siders would put more emphasis on supply. Studying the ills of American economic life, economist Jude Wozinski found answers in modern-day versions of JeanBaptiste Sartre and Leon Walras. So the supply siders, they go back to the work of JeanBaptiste Sartre. Also influenced by the more modern economists such as Arthur Laffer, who as professor of business and finance at the University of South Carolina, was very instrumental in the supply side surge in the 1970s, as was Robert Mundell of Columbia University. The Canadian-born Robert Mundell actually won the Nobel Prize in Economics in the year 1999. Well, Winitsky, who some considered a genius, promoted supply-side economics, which challenged conventional wisdom concerning government revenues. The orthodoxy held it was wise for the government to tax the people to pay for the modern welfare state. Only irresponsible demagogues promoted tax cuts. This was the orthodoxy. Writing in 1978, Winitsky argued that the electorate is wiser than any individual, and the key task of the politician is to divine what it is the electorate wants. In fact, great political ideas are the ones the electorate craves first before the politicians come on board. One idea that is a driving force among the electorate is an economic system that promises maximum capital and greater benefits for all. As Winitsky saw it, the best chance for increased productivity was when government reduced regulation, taxation, tariffs, and welfare benefits. Winitsky's criticism of Keynesianism was that politicians ignored its original purpose of temporarily boosting the economy during times of distress. And they instead employed it primarily to rationalize their income redistribution programs. Quote, liberals who at one time viewed the Keynesian magic as an antidote to Marx's impulse are attracted more and more to collectionist notions, that is, central planning, detailed regulation of commerce, and wage and price controls. The centerpiece behind the economic philosophy of Winitsky's work, his book, The Way the World Works, is the Laffer Curve, named after Arthur Laffer. The curve provided a simple illustration that there are always two tax rates that yield the same revenues. Production ceased when the tax rate was 100%. I mean, workers are not going to work if the government takes all their earnings. So production ceases when the tax rate was 100%. And a tax rate of 0% resulted in zero government revenues. So both 100% and 0% tax rates yield the same revenue. If the government lowered its tax rates to a figure something less than 100%, production increased marginally, as did government revenue. So here you would have a very high tax rate and very low production. Government revenue also increased marginally when the government raised its tax rates to a figure something more than 0%. So here you have a very low tax rate and very high production. In both cases, the amount of government revenue collected is the same. Adopting this method, the supply-siders sought the point in which the electorate desires to be taxed. The point Winiski and other supply-siders expressed was that tax rates in the prohibitive range were counterproductive. It made more economic sense to lower tax rates to ensure greater productivity and thus more government revenue. Winiski quoted David Hume's observation in 1756, quote, "Exorbitant taxes, like extreme necessity, destroy industry by producing despair," end of quote. One problem in the 20th century was that high tax rates resulted in lower government revenues since more people bartered or embraced do-it-yourself work to escape the tax burden. In the late 1970s, economists recognized a large and growing underground economy, somewhere in the range of 10 to 25% of the gross national product. Viewing unemployment and inflation as separate problems that could be solved simultaneously, Winiski and other supply-siders were confident that they had a better model to fight stagflation. Given that there was no consumer per se in a supply-side approach, but instead producers and traders, one only had to focus on policies that removed obstacles to production and trade. On the issue of money, supply-sider concern was for the quality rather than the quantity of money. A gold standard, Winiski argued, offered the most reliable standard of value. Predictability meant less currency risk for those considering long-term contracts. In sum, supply-side economics was more or less classical economics in modern garb. The influence of Karl Marx in America is comparably small, but there were Americans in the past 100 years who demanded comprehensive public ownership. In recent years, there are greater signs of the appeal of socialist economics. For example, a few members of Congress have voiced support for planning, controls, and nationalization as the appropriate economic direction for America. For socialists, national planning was simply human beings making ethical choices on a national scale. Socialism sounded good, and Keynesians and classical economists would have to respond. Now, my concluding paragraph. From the late years of the Great Depression to the late 1970s, Keynesianism dominated economic thinking in America. After the 1970s, there was more attention to the Austrian and Chicago schools of economics and supply-side economics. In the early 21st century, more younger people are looking at socialist approaches to the economy. Recent developments have caused some concern. For example, Thomas Sowell writes, unfortunately, little of the knowledge and understanding within the economics profession has reached the average citizen and voter, leaving politicians free to do things that would never be tolerated if most people understood economics as well as Alfred Marshall understood it a century ago or David Ricardo 2 centuries ago. End of quote. Thank you.